A desperate mother left her newborn baby to die in an abandoned farm shed during the worst dust storm in American history. But what was hiding in that shed didn't kill the baby. It did something that shocked scientists and made headlines around the world. Before I tell you this absolutely true story from 1935, I need to know, what city are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments. And if you believe that miracles can come from the most unexpected places, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story of survival, redemption, and impossible love will leave you absolutely speechless. The Oklahoma dust storm of 1935 was one of the worst in the history of the Dust Bowl, turning day into night and burying entire farms under mountains of dirt. It was during this storm, on a scorching August afternoon, that 21-year-old Mary Sullivan made the most desperate decision of her life. She placed her newborn daughter, barely 12 hours old, wrapped in a thin cotton blanket, inside an old wooden crate in the corner of an abandoned farm shed on the outskirts of what used to be her family's wheat farm. The baby, she hadn't allowed herself to name her, had been born that morning in the back of a broken-down truck, delivered by Mary's own trembling hands as dust clouds rolled across the horizon. There had been no doctor, no midwife, no one to help. Just Mary, alone, exhausted, and more terrified than she'd ever been in her young life. Mary's husband, James, had left 3 months earlier, heading west to California with promises to send for her once he found work. Those promises had turned into a single letter saying he'd met someone else, that he was sorry, that she should try to understand. Mary had been 5 months pregnant when that letter arrived, already struggling to survive on a farm that produced nothing but dust and despair. Her parents were dead, victims of influenza 2 years prior. Her siblings had scattered across the country looking for work. She had no money, no food, no prospects. And now she had a baby she couldn't feed. The decision had formed slowly in Mary's mind over the past 3 months, growing like a cancer. She would have the baby, then leave it somewhere it might be found, somewhere near a town or a church or anywhere people still lived. Someone with resources, someone with food, someone with hope might find the child and give her the life Mary couldn't provide. The abandoned shed she'd chosen had once belonged to the Hendersons, a farming family who'd given up and moved to Tulsa 6 months ago. It sat on the edge of what used to be a busy rural road, though these days few people traveled it. But it was the best option Mary could think of in her exhausted, desperate state. She'd walked 3 miles in the growing dust storm, cradling the newborn against her chest, tears mixing with the dirt on her face. "I'm sorry," Mary whispered to the baby, who was making small mewing sounds, her tiny face scrunched up and red. "I'm so sorry. But you'll die if you stay with me. At least this way, maybe someone will find you. Maybe someone who can actually take care of you." She placed the baby in the wooden crate, which still had bits of old hay in it from when it had stored chicken feed. She tucked the thin blanket around the infant as best she could, then placed a note on top written on a scrap of paper bag. "Her birthday is August 15th, 1935. Please take care of her. I can't. God forgive me." Mary stood there for a long moment, memorizing every detail of her daughter's face. The dark hair, the button nose, the small mouth that was already searching for food Mary didn't have. Then, before her courage failed entirely, she turned and walked out of the shed into the dust storm. She didn't look back because she knew if she did, she wouldn't be able to leave. She had no plan beyond getting as far away as possible, maybe finding work in a city somewhere, maybe disappearing entirely. The guilt would follow her forever, but at least her daughter would have a chance. What Mary didn't know, couldn't have known, was that the Henderson farm wasn't as abandoned as it appeared. What she didn't know was that she'd just placed her newborn daughter in a shed that housed something unexpected, something that would make her desperate act into something extraordinary. In the back corner of that shed, hidden behind old farming equipment and piles of discarded wood, lived a dog. Not just any dog, but an Australian shepherd mix named Molly, who had been left behind when the Hendersons moved. They'd meant to take her, but in the chaos of packing and leaving, they'd somehow forgotten her, or perhaps couldn't find her when it was time to go. Molly had been living in and around that shed for 6 months, surviving on rats, rabbits, and whatever else she could hunt. She was thin, her once beautiful coat matted and dirty, but she was alive and she was tough. She'd survived the dust storms, the heat, the starvation that had killed so many animals in those terrible years. And 3 weeks earlier, Molly had given birth to a litter of 6 puppies in a nest she'd made in the far corner of the shed. 4 of the puppies had died within the first week. She simply couldn't produce enough milk for all of them in her malnourished state. But 2 had survived, a male and a female, both fighting fiercely for every drop of milk their mother could provide. When Mary left her baby in the shed, Molly was in the back with her puppies, too weak and protective to investigate the strange sound and smell immediately. But once the human footsteps faded and the dust storm intensified, making the shed creak and moan, Molly's instincts kicked in. She smelled something she hadn't smelled in a long time, a human baby. Her ears perked up when the infant began to cry, a sound that triggered something deep in her mammalian brain, something that transcended species. Slowly, cautiously, Molly crept from her hiding spot toward the source of the crying. She found the wooden crate with the squirming, wailing infant inside. For a moment, she just stood there, head tilted, trying to understand this strange situation. Her own puppies were crying now too, responding to the sound of another infant in distress. What happened next would later be called miraculous by some, impossible by others, and simply the work of instinct by scientists. Molly, instead of ignoring the human baby or seeing it as a threat, did something extraordinary. She carefully gripped the edge of the blanket in her teeth and began to drag the baby, crate and all, across the rough wooden floor of the shed toward her nest. It took several minutes and multiple attempts, but eventually, she succeeded in moving the crate near her own puppies. Then, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a half-starved animal, she nuzzled the human baby, licking its face the way she would clean her own puppies. The baby's crying intensified briefly at the unfamiliar sensation, but then something remarkable happened. She calmed down. The warmth of the dog's breath, the sensation of being touched and attended to, seemed to soothe her. Molly lay down next to the crate, positioning herself so that her body heat would warm the human infant, just as she'd been doing for her own puppies. And when the baby's cries turned to the desperate sounds of hunger, Molly responded in the only way she knew how. She allowed the human infant to nurse alongside her puppies. It was biologically improbable, but not impossible. Molly's milk production, already stretched thin by nursing her remaining 2 puppies, was somehow stimulated by the presence and demands of this new, strange, hairless puppy that had appeared in her den. Over the next hours, as the dust storm raged outside and darkness fell, Molly did something that would challenge everything people thought they knew about animal behavior and maternal instinct. She adopted a human baby as one of her own. The baby, fighting for survival with the same fierce instinct that had kept Molly's puppies alive, learned quickly to compete for access to milk. The dog, working on pure instinct and perhaps some deeper mammalian understanding of infant need, made room for her. And so began one of the most unusual survival stories in American history. A newborn human infant being kept alive by a dog in an abandoned shed during the worst environmental disaster the country had ever seen. No one knew the baby was there. Mary was gone, walking through dust-filled darkness toward an uncertain future. The Hendersons were in Tulsa, unaware that their forgotten dog was performing a daily miracle. And the baby, too young to understand anything except hunger and cold and the comfort of warmth and milk, simply survived, 1 hour at a time, nursed and protected by an animal that had every reason to reject her but instead chose to save her. For 3 days, the dust storm continued to rage across Oklahoma. The sky remained dark even at midday, the air so thick with dirt that breathing was difficult and visibility was reduced to just a few feet. During those 3 days, in that isolated shed at the edge of an abandoned farm, Molly kept 3 infants alive through sheer determination and instinct. The human baby, whom Molly treated no differently than her puppies, survived those critical first days of life in conditions that should have killed her. She received warmth from Molly's body, milk from desperate nursing sessions where all 3 infants competed for limited resources, and protection from the elements as Molly positioned herself to shield them from the dust that seeped through every crack in the old shed. Molly herself was suffering terribly. The storm had made hunting impossible. No rabbits or rats ventured out in such conditions. She was surviving on her own rapidly depleting fat reserves while trying to produce enough milk for 3 hungry mouths. By the 4th day, when the storm finally began to clear, Molly was skeletal, barely able to stand. But the infants were alive. Weak, certainly, but alive. The human baby in particular showed remarkable resilience. her survival instinct as strong as any wild animal's. She'd learned to cry in a way that got Molly's attention, to push against the puppies when nursing, to burrow into Molly's fur for warmth. She was adapting to this impossible situation because she had no choice: adapt or die. It was on the 5th day after Mary's abandonment that someone finally came to the shed. Pastor William Fletcher from the Prairie Hope Community Church in the nearest town, about 5 miles away, had been making his rounds checking on isolated farms and properties after the storm. The church had been trying to help struggling families, providing what little food and supplies they could gather. Pastor Fletcher, a weathered man in his 50s who'd seen more suffering in the past 5 years than in his previous decades of ministry, approached the Henderson property not expecting to find anything. He knew the family had left months ago, but as he walked near the shed, he heard something that made him stop in his tracks: the sound of a baby crying. It was faint, almost lost in the wind, but unmistakable. Pastor Fletcher's heart began to race. He'd been called to abandoned farms before, finding awful things: people who'd died of starvation or dust pneumonia, entire families who'd given up. A baby's cry could mean many things, none of them good. He approached the shed cautiously and pulled open the creaking door. The sight that greeted him would stay with him for the rest of his life. In the dim light filtering through cracks in the walls, he saw an emaciated dog lying on her side, nursing what appeared to be 2 puppies. But next to the puppies, also nursing, was unmistakably a human infant. The baby's lower half was still wrapped in a dirty cotton blanket, but her upper body was bare, pressed against the dog's belly alongside the puppy's. She was covered in dog hair, dirt, and God knows what else, but she was alive, and she was actively feeding. "Dear God in heaven," Pastor Fletcher whispered, frozen in the doorway. The dog, Molly, raised her head and growled softly, a warning. She positioned herself more protectively over all 3 infants, including the human one. It was clear from her posture that she saw the baby as hers to protect. Pastor Fletcher, understanding that he needed to be careful or the dog might become aggressive, spoke softly. "It's okay, girl. It's okay. I'm not going to hurt them. I'm here to help." He slowly backed out of the shed and ran to his truck, where he had some supplies from the church, including some canned meat and water. He also had a blanket and his first aid kit. He grabbed everything and returned to the shed, moving slowly and speaking constantly in soothing tones. First, he opened the can of meat and placed it near Molly. The dog was clearly desperate for food, but her maternal instinct was so strong that she was reluctant to leave the infants even for a moment. Pastor Fletcher waited patiently, and finally, hunger won out. Molly quickly gulped down the meat while keeping one eye on her charges. While the dog ate, Pastor Fletcher carefully picked up the human baby. She immediately began to cry, and Molly whined anxiously, but didn't attack. The pastor quickly examined the infant. She was a girl, looked to be less than a week old, severely dehydrated, covered in filth, but miraculously alive. Her reflexes seemed good, her color was reasonably healthy given the circumstances, and despite everything, she was alert and responsive. He found the note that Mary had left, now partially buried in dust and debris. Her birthday is August 15, 1935. Please take care of her. I can't. God forgive me. Today was August 20th. This baby had been in this shed for 5 days, surviving on dog's milk. It was medically improbable, but here was the evidence, crying in his arms. Pastor Fletcher knew he needed to get the baby to a doctor immediately, but he also recognized something else. This dog had saved this child's life. Whatever happened next, Molly deserved recognition and care for what she'd done. He carefully placed the baby back near Molly, who immediately sniffed her and licked her face, checking that she was okay, and went back to his truck. He had a crate that he sometimes used for transporting supplies. He brought it to the shed and, speaking constantly to Molly in soothing tones, he carefully placed all 3 infants in the crate together. Then he offered his hand to Molly to sniff. "Come on, girl. We're going to get all of you help. You did good. You did so good. Now let me help you." Molly, exhausted and seeming to understand on some level that this human meant no harm, allowed herself to be led out of the shed. When Pastor Fletcher picked up the crate with the 3 infants, Molly followed immediately, whining anxiously. He placed the crate in the cab of his truck with Molly jumping in beside it, and then he drove as quickly as the rough roads would allow toward town, toward help, toward the beginning of a story that would capture the nation's imagination. At the Prairie Hope Medical Clinic, a small facility with 1 doctor and 2 nurses serving the surrounding rural area, Dr. Sarah Mitchell initially thought Pastor Fletcher was joking when he explained what he'd found. A baby being nursed by a dog? William, are you sure the dust hasn't gotten to your head? But when she saw the evidence, the baby covered in dog hair, clearly having been cared for by the animal, the dog hovering anxiously over the infant, the puppies mixed in, she had to believe it. I've never seen anything like this, Dr. Mitchell said, carefully examining the baby while Molly watched nervously. She's dehydrated, malnourished, and desperately needs proper nutrition and care. But she's alive, Pastor. Against all odds, she's alive. The doctor looked at Molly, who was panting and watching every move they made with the baby. That dog has been producing milk despite being nearly starved herself. The maternal instinct is stronger than we typically give animals credit for. She saved this child's life. There's no question about it. Word spread quickly through the small town. By that evening, everyone in Prairie Hope knew about the baby found being nursed by a dog in an abandoned shed. The story was so extraordinary, so improbable, that it seemed like something from a fairy tale rather than the harsh reality of Dust Bowl, Oklahoma. The local newspaper editor, a man named Robert Hayes, saw the story's potential immediately. He contacted larger papers in Oklahoma City and Tulsa. By the next day, reporters were arriving in Prairie Hope, wanting to see the baby and the dog, wanting to verify this incredible story. Photographs were taken, images that would later become famous. Molly lying down with 2 puppies and the human baby nestled against her, the baby's tiny hand resting on the dog's fur. The baby being fed from a bottle by a nurse while Molly watched protectively from nearby. These images, capturing something profound about maternal instinct that transcended species, would soon be seen across the country. The question everyone was asking, who was the mother who had abandoned this baby? And where was she now? Pastor Fletcher had found the note, but it provided no names, no real identifying information. The authorities began investigating, asking around the area if anyone knew of a pregnant woman who'd recently disappeared or a newborn who'd gone missing. But in those desperate times, people were disappearing every day, heading west, heading anywhere they thought might offer hope. Finding one desperate mother in the chaos of the Dust Bowl seemed nearly impossible. Meanwhile, the baby needed a name and a plan for her future. Dr. Mitchell and the nurse, Mrs. Eleanor Carson, had been caring for her at the clinic. The child was responding well to proper nutrition and was showing signs of improvement. But she couldn't stay at the clinic indefinitely. The question of what would happen to her, and to Molly and her puppies, became a matter of urgent community discussion. As news of the Dust Bowl miracle baby spread across the nation, Prairie Hope, Oklahoma, found itself at the center of unexpected attention. Reporters from major newspapers and even radio broadcasters arrived in the small town, all wanting to document the incredible story of a newborn saved by a dog. The images and story provided a rare moment of hope and wonder during the darkest days of the Depression and Dust Bowl, when most news was relentlessly grim. Life magazine sent a photographer who captured haunting images, Molly lying protectively beside the baby, both of them being cared for at the clinic, the baby's tiny fingers gripping the dog's fur, Pastor Fletcher holding the infant while Molly sat at his feet, looking up anxiously. The photographs were published in the September 1935 issue under the headline, "Love Knows No Species: How a Dog Saved a Dust Bowl Baby." The story resonated with people across America who were themselves struggling through impossibly hard times. The attention brought both opportunities and complications. Dozens of families wrote to Prairie Hope expressing interest in adopting the baby. Some were genuine offers from people who wanted to help. Others seemed more interested in the novelty and fame associated with the miracle baby. Dr. Mitchell and Pastor Fletcher, along with Eleanor Carson and other community leaders, formed an informal committee to determine the best course of action for the child's future. "We need to find her mother first," Pastor Fletcher argued at one of their meetings. "She left a note, which means there was some part of her that cared about the baby's fate. Maybe she thought she had no choice. Maybe now that there's help available, she'd want to come back. And maybe she's 100 miles from here by now, trying to forget, countered Robert Hayes, the newspaper editor. We can't keep this baby in limbo indefinitely while we search for a woman who might not want to be found. It was Eleanor Carson who had the idea that would ultimately change everything. What about Molly? She asked. Everyone's so focused on placing the baby with a human family, but has anyone noticed that this child is bonded to that dog in a way I've never seen before? When we separate them, the baby cries inconsolably. Molly paces and whines. They've formed an attachment during those critical first days. Whatever family takes this child, they need to take Molly and her puppies too. They're a package deal. The room fell silent as people considered this. It was an unusual proposition, requiring adoptive parents to take on not just an infant but also a dog and 2 puppies. But Eleanor was right. The bond between the baby and Molly was undeniable and profound. That's not practical, Dr. Mitchell said, though her tone was uncertain. How many families are prepared to take on that kind of responsibility, especially in these times when people can barely feed themselves? Then we wait until we find the right family, Eleanor said firmly. This child survived because of that dog. We don't separate them now. While this debate continued in Prairie Hope, something else was happening 300 miles away in Amarillo, Texas. Mary Sullivan had made it that far in her desperate flight from Oklahoma, working odd jobs for food, sleeping in homeless camps, trying to outrun her guilt and grief. She'd been successful in finding work at a diner, washing dishes for minimal pay and meals. She'd told no one about the baby, about what she'd done. But she couldn't escape the memories or the physical reminders. Her breasts still produced milk, her body still ached from childbirth, her dreams were filled with the sound of an infant crying. One evening in late August, Mary was cleaning up after the diner's dinner rush when she heard the radio in the corner. The broadcaster was sharing human interest stories, including one about an extraordinary event in Oklahoma. A newborn baby girl found being nursed by a dog in an abandoned shed near Prairie Hope. The child, believed to have been abandoned during the recent dust storm, was kept alive for 5 days by an Australian Shepherd mix that had recently given birth to her own puppies. Both the baby and the dog are recovering well, and authorities are searching for the child's mother. Mary dropped the plate she was holding. It shattered on the floor, but she barely noticed. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to grip the counter for support. Her daughter was alive. The baby she'd left to die was alive. A dog, had saved her daughter's life. The diner owner, a kind woman named Ruth, rushed over when she heard the crash. "Mary, honey, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Mary opened her mouth but no words came out. Tears started streaming down her face. Ruth, concerned, led her to a chair in the back. "What's wrong? What is it?" And Mary, unable to hold it in any longer, told her everything. About the pregnancy, about James leaving, about the desperate poverty, about giving birth alone, about the impossible decision to leave her baby in that shed thinking it was the merciful thing to do because at least death would be quick. About the guilt that had been eating her alive ever since. "That baby on the radio," Mary whispered. "That's my daughter. I left her there. And somehow, impossibly, she's alive." Ruth listened to the entire story without interruption. When Mary finished, the older woman was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that would change the course of both Mary's and the baby's lives. "Then you need to go back and get her." Mary looked up in shock. "What? No, I can't. I abandoned her. They'll arrest me. They'll hate me. I don't deserve. What you deserve and what that baby needs are 2 different things," Ruth interrupted gently but firmly. "That child is alive. You're her mother. Maybe you made the only choice you thought you had at the time, but now you have a different choice. You can let guilt and shame keep you away, or you can be brave enough to go back and try to make things right." "But I have nothing," Mary protested. "I'm still as poor as I was then. How can I take care of her?" You have something you didn't have before, Ruth said. You have people who know your story now. You have a community that's paying attention. And you have a dog that proved maternal instinct is stronger than circumstances. If a starving dog could keep your baby alive, don't tell me you can't find a way. The conversation haunted Mary for 2 days. She barely slept, barely ate, torn between the desperate desire to see her daughter and the paralyzing fear of facing judgment and consequences for what she'd done. But finally, the need to see her child, to know for certain that she was real and alive, overcame everything else. Mary used the little money she'd saved to buy a bus ticket back to Oklahoma. The journey took 2 days, and every mile felt like both a step closer to redemption and a march toward judgment. When she finally arrived in Prairie Hope in early September, the town was still buzzing with activity from all the attention. Mary, dirty from travel and terrified, went first to the church, thinking a pastor might be more understanding than the authorities. Pastor Fletcher was in his office when Mary knocked tentatively on the door. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm looking for. There was a baby found. About 2 weeks ago. In a shed." Pastor Fletcher looked up and immediately knew who she was. Something about her eyes, her age, her obvious desperation. "You're the mother," he said. It wasn't a question. Mary nodded, tears already falling. Is she really alive? Is she okay? "Come with me," Pastor Fletcher said, standing. He led Mary to the clinic, which was just across the street. During the walk, he explained what had happened, how he'd found the baby, the condition she'd been in, the miraculous care provided by Molly, the recovery process. "She's healthy now," he said. "Thriving, actually. We've been calling her Hope since we didn't know her real name." They entered the clinic, and Pastor Fletcher led Mary to a room where Dr. Mitchell was checking on the baby. Eleanor Carson was there too, feeding the infant a bottle while Molly lay on the floor beside them, watching carefully. When Mary saw her daughter, really saw her, healthy and clean and very much alive, she let out a sob and her legs gave out. Pastor Fletcher caught her and helped her to a chair. Dr. Mitchell and Eleanor immediately understood who this was. "I'm so sorry," Mary was saying through her tears. "I'm so sorry. I thought I was doing the merciful thing. I thought she'd die quickly and not suffer. I didn't know what else to do. I had nothing. I was starving. I couldn't feed her. I couldn't." Her words dissolved into incoherent sobbing. Eleanor, still holding the baby, looked at Dr. Mitchell and Pastor Fletcher. An entire conversation happened in that glance. This was the moment they'd been waiting for, but now that it was here, it was complicated. This young woman was clearly devastated by what she'd done, clearly loved her child despite her desperate action. But she'd also committed what was legally abandonment, what could be considered attempted murder, even if that hadn't been her intention. "Mary," Pastor Fletcher said gently, having learned her name from her stammered apologies, "we need to talk about what happens next. But first, would you like to hold your daughter?" Mary looked up, shocked. "You'd let me? After what I did?" "She's your daughter," Eleanor said simply, standing and walking over with the baby. "And she's alive. That's what matters now." Eleanor carefully placed the infant in Mary's arms. The baby, who'd been fed and content, opened her eyes and looked up at Mary's face. And Mary, holding her daughter for the first time since that terrible day, felt something break open inside her chest. All the grief and guilt and love she'd been suppressing came flooding out. But so did something else. Hope. "What's her name?" Dr. Mitchell asked gently. "I never named her," Mary whispered. "I was afraid to. Afraid it would make it harder to leave her." "The town's been calling her Hope," Pastor Fletcher said. "But you're her mother. You should choose." Mary looked down at her daughter, then at Molly, who had stood up and was watching the interaction carefully. "Grace," Mary said softly. "Her name is Grace. Because Grace is what saved her. And Grace is what I don't deserve but I'm praying for anyway." The following days were emotionally intense and legally complicated. Mary's return forced the community of Prairie Hope to confront difficult questions about judgment, mercy, desperation, and redemption. The county sheriff, a pragmatic man named Tom Morrison, was called in to investigate. Technically, Mary had committed a crime, child abandonment at minimum, potentially more severe charges if the prosecutor wanted to push it. But Sheriff Morrison, after interviewing Mary and hearing the full story, was reluctant to arrest her. "Look," he told the assembled community leaders, "I understand the law. But I also understand desperation. This girl was 21, pregnant, abandoned by her husband, with no family, no money, and no prospects during the worst economic disaster this country has seen. She made a terrible choice, but she thought she was out of options. And now she's come back, knowing she could face prison, because she wants to make it right. That takes courage." "So you're saying we just forgive attempted murder?" demanded one of the more conservative town council members. "That baby could have died. Would have died if not for that dog." "But she didn't die," Eleanor Carson interjected. "And I've spent 2 weeks with that baby and with Mary now. That girl loves her child. What she did came from desperation, not malice. Punishing her doesn't help anyone, least of all Grace." Dr. Mitchell added her medical perspective. "Mary is suffering from what we now recognize as postpartum depression, exacerbated by extreme stress, poverty, and trauma. She wasn't in her right mind when she made that decision. She needs help, not prison." The debate raged for days, both within the community and in the press, which was following the story closely. Some voices called for Mary's prosecution, arguing that allowing her to escape consequences would set a dangerous precedent. Others argued for compassion, pointing out that the circumstances were so extreme that normal rules couldn't apply. The turning point came from an unexpected source, a letter published in the Daily Oklahoma newspaper, written by Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of the United States. Mrs. Roosevelt had followed the story and was moved by it. Her letter read, in part, "The story of young Mary Sullivan and her daughter Grace reminds us that we cannot judge desperate actions taken in desperate times without understanding the full context of suffering. This young woman found herself in an impossible situation during an unprecedented crisis. She made a choice that haunts her, but she believed it was merciful. She believed her child would die quickly rather than slowly starve. The fact that a dog, a starving dog herself, chose to nurture rather than harm this vulnerable infant should teach us something about the capacity for compassion that exists in all creatures. If a dog could show such mercy, can we humans do any less?" The letter continued to argue that Mary should be given the chance to raise her daughter, with support from the community and appropriate oversight to ensure both mother and child thrived. The publicity from Mrs. Roosevelt's letter shifted public opinion dramatically. Donations began flooding into Prairie Hope, designated to help Mary Sullivan get on her feet. People sent money, baby clothes, supplies, and job offers. The outpouring of support was overwhelming. Sheriff Morrison, seeing the shift in public sentiment and genuinely believing that mercy was appropriate in this case, made a recommendation to the prosecutor. No criminal charges, but mandatory supervision. Mary would have to meet regularly with a social worker, undergo mental health treatment for her postpartum depression, and accept help from the community in caring for Grace. If she proved herself a capable and loving mother over a probationary period of 1 year, the case would be closed permanently. The prosecutor agreed, and so did the judge who reviewed the case. In late September 1935, Mary Sullivan was officially granted custody of her daughter Grace under supervised conditions. But there was one more complication to resolve: Molly and her puppies. True to Eleanor Carson's conviction that the dog and the baby should not be separated, the custody arrangement included a unique provision. Mary would also take guardianship of Molly and her 2 surviving puppies, who were now 2 months old and healthy thanks to improved nutrition once Pastor Fletcher had rescued them all. "I don't know how to take care of a dog," Mary admitted to Eleanor. "I've never had a pet. We were too poor growing up." "Molly doesn't need much," Eleanor assured her. "She needs food, water, shelter, and love. The same things Grace needs. And Mary, that dog kept your daughter alive. The least we can do is make sure they stay together." A small house on the edge of Prairie Hope had been arranged for Mary. donated rent-free for the first year by a local widow who'd been moved by the story. It was simple, just 2 rooms, but it was clean and sound. Community members furnished it with basics: a bed, a crib that served for Grace, bowls for the dog, a wood stove, basic kitchen supplies. People brought food, canned goods, flour, vegetables from gardens, even fresh milk from those lucky enough to still have cows. Mary, Grace, Molly, and the 2 puppies, whom Mary named Hope and Mercy after some thought about what those dogs represented, moved into their new home in early October. The first weeks were an adjustment. Mary was learning to be a mother under the watchful eye of the community, with regular visits from Mrs. Patterson, the social worker assigned to her case. She was also learning to care for 3 dogs, which turned out to be easier than she'd feared. Molly was gentle and well-behaved, still protective of Grace in ways that were touching to observe. The puppies were energetic and kept Mary busy, but they also brought joy and laughter into the house, something Mary hadn't experienced in a long time. Grace, now nearly 2 months old, was thriving. The dog's milk had kept her alive during those critical first days, but now she was on formula and then proper milk, and she was growing well. Dr. Mitchell monitored her carefully and reported that despite the traumatic start, Grace showed no signs of developmental delays or health problems. "She's a fighter," Dr. Mitchell told Mary during one checkup. "Just like her mother." Mary was also working. She'd been hired at the general store in town, working part-time while a neighbor watched Grace. The wages were modest, but combined with the continued donations and support, it was enough to survive on. Something else was happening too. Mary was healing. With proper nutrition, with support from the community, with purpose in caring for Grace and the dogs, her postpartum depression began to lift. She started attending a women's group at Pastor Fletcher's church, where she met other mothers struggling through hard times. She made friends, found community, and slowly began to forgive herself for what she'd done. The bond between Grace and Molly remained extraordinary. As Grace grew from newborn to infant, she showed a preference for Molly's presence. When the baby cried, Molly would come and lie next to her crib, and Grace would calm down. As Grace learned to grasp objects, she'd reach for Molly's fur. The dog tolerated this with patient gentleness, seeming to understand that this hairless, clumsy puppy needed special care. By Grace's first birthday in August 1936, the transformation was complete. The desperate, traumatized girl who'd abandoned her baby in a shed had become a capable, loving mother. The starving dog who'd adopted a human infant was now a healthy, beloved family pet. And the baby who should have died had become a healthy, happy toddler, walking and starting to say her first words, one of which was, Momo, her attempt at saying Molly. The community of Prairie Hope celebrated Grace's first birthday with a party that was covered by newspapers across the country. It represented something important: hope and redemption in dark times, the power of compassion, the strength of community, and the extraordinary bonds that could form across species when instinct and love aligned. Pastor Fletcher gave a short speech at the party that captured what many were feeling. A year ago, 3 desperate creatures, a starving dog, a dying baby, and a heartbroken mother, were all facing death in different ways. Today, they're all thriving. This didn't happen because of any one person's actions. It happened because of a combination of factors: instinct, luck, timing, and most importantly, a community that chose compassion over judgment. Let this be a lesson to us all about what's possible when we choose mercy. But the story wasn't quite finished. There was one more chapter waiting to be written, one that would come from an unexpected direction and would test everything Mary and her community had built together. In the spring of 1937, when Grace was nearly 2 years old, something happened that Mary had both dreaded and secretly hoped for. James Sullivan, her estranged husband who had abandoned her while pregnant, showed up in Prairie Hope. He'd read about the miracle baby story and had seen photographs in newspapers. He'd recognized Mary in the pictures. Now he was back, claiming he wanted to be part of his daughter's life, and perhaps to reconcile with Mary. Mary was working at the general store when James walked in. She was helping a customer and didn't notice him at first. When she finally looked up and their eyes met, the color drained from her face. "Hello, Mary," James said, his hat in his hands, his expression a mixture of guilt and determination. "We need to talk." Mary excused herself from work. Her employer, knowing her story, understood, and met James outside. Molly, who often accompanied Mary to town and waited outside the store, immediately positioned herself between Mary and James, growling low in her throat. "Easy, girl," Mary said, putting a hand on Molly's head. The dog quieted but remained alert, her body tense. "You have a dog now," James observed, trying to sound casual. "That's not just any dog," Mary said coldly. "That's the dog that saved our daughter's life after you abandoned us." James flinched. "Mary, I know I was wrong. I know I hurt you. But I want to make it right. I want to be a father to Grace. I want us to be a family again." "Now you want to be a father?" Mary's voice was rising despite her efforts to stay calm. "Where were you when I was pregnant and starving? Where were you when I gave birth alone in the back of a truck? Where were you when I was so desperate that I—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The memory of that day in the shed still haunted her. "I was scared," James admitted. "I was a coward. But I've been working in California, and I've saved some money. I can provide for you and Grace now. We could start over." Mary felt a complicated swirl of emotions. Part of her, the part that remembered falling in love with James, the part that had dreamed of raising their child together, wanted to believe him. But a larger part, the part that had been forged in desperation and hardship and had learned what real strength and loyalty looked like, was skeptical. "You left me a letter saying you'd found someone else," she said. "You made your choice. And now that you see there's a story, that there's attention and probably opportunities, suddenly you want to be involved?" "I don't think so, James." "That's not fair," James protested. "I'm Grace's father. I have rights." This was the confrontation Mary had feared. Legally, James was Grace's father. Despite his abandonment, despite everything, he could potentially sue for custody or visitation. And unlike Mary, he had no record of abandonment. She did. What followed over the next months was a painful legal and emotional battle. James hired a lawyer and filed for joint custody of Grace. His argument was straightforward. He was the biological father, he now had the means to provide financial support, and he deserved the chance to be part of his daughter's life. Mary's lawyer, provided pro bono by a legal aid society that had taken interest in her case, argued that James had abandoned them, had forfeited his rights through his actions, and that Grace was thriving in Mary's care with no need for his disruptive influence. The case became another media sensation. "Miracle Baby's Father Returns" was the headline that spread across papers. Public opinion was divided. Some sympathized with James, believing in second chances and the importance of fathers in children's lives. Others saw him as an opportunist trying to capitalize on his daughter's fame or to assuage his guilt. The trial was held in May 1937. The courtroom was packed with reporters and townspeople. Grace, now almost 2, was too young to testify, but her well-being was the center of everything. The prosecution called witnesses who testified to James's abandonment and his letter stating he'd found someone else. They brought in Mrs. Patterson, the social worker, who testified that Mary had been an exemplary mother during the supervision period and that Grace was thriving. They called Dr. Mitchell, who described the condition Grace had been in when found and the remarkable recovery under Mary's care. And in a move that surprised everyone, they called Pastor Fletcher to testify about what he'd witnessed. "When I found that baby in the shed," Pastor Fletcher said from the witness stand, "she was being kept alive by a dog who was herself starving. That dog had more loyalty and maternal instinct than the man who fathered that child. She stayed. She sacrificed. She saved a life. Mr. Sullivan left. He chose himself over his family. I believe actions speak louder than words, and his actions told us who he is." James's lawyer tried to paint a picture of a man who'd made a mistake but had reformed, who'd been scared but now was ready to step up. They emphasized his current employment and financial stability. But when James took the stand and tried to explain his actions, even sympathetic observers found his excuses weak. "I panicked when she told me she was pregnant," James admitted. "We were already struggling, and I thought things would just get worse. So I left. I don't know what I thought. That she'd figure it out, I guess. You thought she'd figure it out? Mary's lawyer pressed. Figure out how to survive with no money, no job, no support, while pregnant and then with a newborn, during the Dust Bowl? I wasn't thinking clearly, James said weakly. You were thinking clearly enough to write her a letter saying you'd found someone else, the lawyer countered. What happened to that someone else, Mr. Sullivan? Did she leave you? Is that why you're back now? James had no good answer. The judge, a woman named Margaret Holloway who had a reputation for no-nonsense rulings, took just one day to make her decision. She ruled that James Sullivan had abandoned his family in their time of greatest need, that he had demonstrated neither loyalty nor paternal instinct, and that his current desire for involvement appeared motivated by public attention rather than genuine care for his daughter. She terminated his parental rights and awarded full, unsupervised custody to Mary. Mr. Sullivan, Judge Holloway said from the bench, you had a chance to be a father. You chose not to take it. You don't get to come back years later when it's convenient and claim that role. Mary Sullivan has proven herself a devoted mother despite circumstances that would have broken most people. Grace is thriving under her care. I see no reason to disrupt that. The ruling was final. James could appeal, but his lawyer advised against it. The evidence was too strong against him, and the public opinion was decidedly not in his favor. James left Prairie Hope and Mary never heard from him again. Years later, she heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved to Oregon, remarried, and had other children. She felt nothing about this news except perhaps a distant sense of relief that he'd found a life elsewhere and wasn't going to interfere with hers. The legal battle had been stressful, but it had also brought closure. Mary could now move forward without fear that Grace would be taken from her, or that her past would continue to haunt her future. The community of Prairie Hope, which had supported her throughout the trial, celebrated the victory. More importantly, the trial had brought attention to the need for legal protections for mothers in desperate situations, particularly during economic crises. Several lawyers who'd followed the case began working on model legislation that would protect parents who made desperate choices during extreme circumstances, as long as they later sought to make amends. It wasn't passed immediately, but the seeds were planted for future reform. By Grace's third birthday in 1938, life had settled into a new normal. Mary had been promoted to assistant manager at the general store. She and Grace had moved to a slightly larger house, still provided by the community, but with a yard where Molly and the now-adult dogs Hope and Mercy could run and play. Grace was a bright, energetic toddler who seemed to have a special affinity for animals. Not surprising given that her first sibling had been a puppy and her first caregiver had been a dog. She was gentle with Molly, who was now aging but still devoted to the little girl she'd saved. The bond between them was something special that everyone noticed. People would comment on how Grace seemed to understand Molly in ways that went beyond normal child-pet interactions. She could sense when the dog wasn't feeling well, would bring her water without being asked, and would sit quietly beside Molly when the old dog was tired. They saved each other, Eleanor Carson observed to Mary one day as they watched Grace and Molly napping together on the porch. Molly kept Grace alive in that shed, and now Grace gives Molly purpose and love in her old age. It's beautiful. Mary nodded, tears in her eyes as they often were when she thought about how close she'd come to losing everything. I was so sure I was doing the right thing, leaving her there, Mary said softly. I thought death would be merciful compared to starvation. I thought I was choosing the lesser evil. But I was wrong. There's always another choice, always another way, even when you can't see it. You were desperate, Eleanor said gently. And you came back. That's what matters. As the years passed and Grace grew from toddler to child, the story of her miraculous survival became part of Prairie Hope's history, part of Mary's family story, and part of a larger narrative about resilience during the Dust Bowl. What had started as an act of desperate abandonment had become a story of redemption, community, and the extraordinary power of maternal instinct, whether human or canine. But there was one more chapter to the story, one that wouldn't be written until many years later, when Grace was grown and had children of her own. Grace Sullivan grew up knowing her origin story. Mary never hid it from her. She believed her daughter deserved to know the truth about her beginning, no matter how painful. Starting when Grace was about 5 years old, Mary began telling her an age-appropriate version. When you were a tiny baby, Mommy was very sick and very scared, and I made a mistake. But a wonderful dog named Molly took care of you until Mommy could get better and come back for you. Molly saved your life, and Mommy will never stop being grateful for that. As Grace got older, Mary filled in more details, always honest about her own desperation and poor choice, but also about the extraordinary circumstances and the community's compassion. Grace, rather than being traumatized by the story, seemed to draw strength from it. I'm a survivor, she would say with a child's simple confidence. Molly and Mommy both saved me. That makes me extra lucky. Molly lived to be 14 years old, which was a good long life for a dog, especially one who'd endured the hardships she had. When she died peacefully in her sleep in 1943, 8-year-old Grace was devastated. The entire town of Prairie Hope attended Molly's burial in the small pet cemetery behind the church. Pastor Fletcher, now elderly himself, gave a eulogy that there wasn't a dry eye for. This dog, more than any human I've known, embodied the pure essence of maternal love. She was starving, she was desperate, she had every reason to reject or even harm that human baby left in her domain. Instead, she chose compassion. She chose sacrifice. She chose love. Because of Molly, a child lived. Because of Molly, a mother got a second chance. Because of Molly, a community learned what grace and mercy really mean. She was, in every way that matters, a hero. A small headstone was placed at Molly's grave, funded by community donations. It read, Molly, 1929 to 1943. The dog who saved a life and taught a town about love. Grace kept Molly's collar for the rest of her life, a tangible reminder of the dog who'd been her first protector. Hope and Mercy, Molly's puppies, lived several more years and were beloved members of the household until they too passed of old age. By the time Grace was a teenager in the late 1940s, the Dust Bowl was over, World War II had ended, and America was entering a new era of prosperity. Prairie Hope, like many small towns, was changing. Some families who'd left during the Dust Bowl returned, others had moved on permanently. Mary continued working at the general store, which had expanded as the economy improved. She never remarried. She said she was too busy raising Grace and too content with the life they'd built together to complicate it with another relationship. Grace excelled in school and showed particular interest in biology and animal behavior, perhaps unsurprisingly. She wrote her high school senior thesis on cross-species maternal behavior, using her own story as the central case study. The paper was so well-researched and compelling that it was published in a regional scientific journal, unusual for a high school student. When Grace graduated in 1953, she had scholarship offers from several universities. She chose to study veterinary medicine at Oklahoma State University, one of the few fields where women were beginning to be accepted in larger numbers. I want to understand what Molly did for me, Grace explained to her mother. I want to understand animal behavior and intelligence and emotion. And I want to help animals the way Molly helped me. Mary was immensely proud, though she worried about Grace leaving Prairie Hope. But she also understood that her daughter needed to build her own life, needed to be more than just the miracle baby. At Oklahoma State, Grace initially tried to keep her story private. She wanted to be known for her academic abilities, not her unusual origin. But when she wrote a research paper on maternal behavior in canines and referenced her own experience, the story came out. Rather than becoming a burden, it actually enhanced her credibility. Professors were fascinated by her first-hand experience with cross-species bonding, and Grace found herself becoming an informal expert on animal behavior and human-animal relationships. She graduated with honors in 1957 and went on to become one of Oklahoma's first female veterinarians. She opened a practice in Oklahoma City that specialized in caring for working dogs and rescue animals. Her approach, informed by deep respect for animal intelligence and emotion, earned her a reputation as an extraordinary vet. Grace married in 1959, a kind man named Daniel Park who worked as a teacher and who loved Grace's passion for animals. They had 3 children, and Grace made sure all of them grew up with dogs, telling them the story of Molly and instilling in them the same respect for animal life that she developed. In 1975, 40 years after the events that had made her famous, Grace was invited to speak at a national conference on animal behavior. She was now Dr. Grace Sullivan Park, a respected veterinarian and researcher, but the conference organizers knew her origin story and thought it would be powerful to have her share it. Grace, now 40 years old, stood before an audience of scientists, veterinarians, and animal behaviorists and told her story from the unique perspective of being both the subject and an expert. "I am alive today because a dog made a choice," Grace began. Molly wasn't acting on training or on any relationship with humans. She was a semi-feral dog, abandoned herself, struggling to keep her own puppies alive. When she found me, she had every reason to ignore me or see me as competition for resources. Instead, she extended her maternal care to include me. Why? Grace went on to discuss what research had revealed about maternal hormones, about how the sound of infant crying could trigger nurturing responses across species, about the neurological basis for empathy in mammals. "But here's what science can't fully explain," she continued. "The day-to-day choice to keep caring for me. To allow me to nurse even though it meant less milk for her own puppies. To protect me, to clean me, to treat me as one of her own. That went beyond instinct into something we might call love, or compassion, or empathy. Whatever we call it, it saved my life." She concluded with a call to action. "We often talk about what humans can teach animals, obedience, tricks, behaviors. But we rarely talk about what animals can teach us. Molly taught my mother, my community, and me about unconditional care. About choosing compassion over self-interest. About extending help to those who are vulnerable, even when we ourselves are struggling. These are lessons humans desperately need to learn and relearn. I've dedicated my life to caring for animals because one animal cared for me when I was most vulnerable. That's a debt I can never fully repay, but I can honor Molly's legacy by treating every animal I encounter with the dignity and respect she showed me." The speech received a standing ovation and was later published in multiple journals and anthologies. It brought renewed attention to Grace's story, and she found herself becoming an advocate not just for animal welfare but also for mothers in crisis. She worked with social service organizations to ensure that desperate mothers had resources and options beyond abandonment. Mary Sullivan, now in her early 60s, watched her daughter's success with quiet pride. She had lived long enough to see her terrible choice redeemed not just by Grace's survival but by what Grace had built from that survival. In 1985, 50 years after the events in the shed, Prairie Hope held a commemoration ceremony. A monument was erected in the town square with a bronze sculpture of a dog curled protectively around a baby. The plaque read, "In memory of Molly, 1929 to 1943, and in celebration of Grace Sullivan Park." This sculpture commemorates an act of cross-species compassion that saved a life and reminded a community of the power of mercy. May we always choose compassion over judgment, and may we remember that help can come from the most unexpected sources. Grace, now 50, attended the ceremony with her mother, her husband, and her children. Mary was 71 now, her health declining but her spirit still strong. Mother and daughter stood together before the monument, Mary leaning on Grace for support. "I never thought I'd live to see this day," Mary said softly. "A monument celebrating what came from the worst thing I ever did." "It's not celebrating what you did, Mama," Grace corrected gently. "It's celebrating what Molly did, what the community did, and what you did afterward. You came back. You faced judgment. You became the mother I needed. That's what this is about, redemption and second chances." Mary turned to look at her daughter, this accomplished, compassionate woman who'd come from such a desperate beginning. "I am so proud of you," she said, tears streaming down her lined face. "You took what could have destroyed you and turned it into something beautiful. You're stronger than I ever was." "I learned from the best," Grace replied, embracing her mother. "From you and from Molly. Both of you showed me what it means to fight for survival and to care for others even when it's hard." Mary Sullivan died peacefully in her sleep 6 months later, in February 1986. She was buried in Prairie Hope Cemetery, not far from where Molly had been laid to rest over 40 years earlier. The inscription on her stone read, "Mary Sullivan, 1914 to 1986. Mother of Grace." She made a terrible choice in desperate times, then spent the rest of her life choosing love. Forgiven and remembered. Grace continued her veterinary practice for another decade before retiring. She spent her retirement years writing a memoir called Saved by Molly that became a bestseller and was later adapted into a film, and working with animal rescue organizations and social service agencies that helped mothers in crisis. When Grace died in 2015 at the age of 80, obituaries across the country told her remarkable story. But the most touching tribute came from her grandchildren, who had all gone into helping professions. One became a social worker, one a veterinary surgeon, one a child psychologist. At Grace's funeral, they spoke about how her story had shaped their entire family's values. "Our grandmother taught us that survival isn't enough," one granddaughter said. "That what matters is what you do with the second chance you're given." She was given life by a dog and a community that showed mercy. She spent the rest of her life extending that same mercy to others. That's her legacy, and that's what we carry forward. The bronze statue of Molly and the baby still stands in Prairie Hope's town square. Every year on August 15th, the date Mary left Grace in that shed and the date Grace survived against all odds, the town holds a small ceremony. People bring their dogs, stories are shared about Molly and Grace, and the community reflects on themes of compassion, second chances, and the bonds that transcend species. The story that began with an act of desperation in a dusty shed during America's darkest economic hour became a story about hope, redemption, and the extraordinary capacity for love, both human and animal. It reminded generations that maternal instinct is a powerful force that can bridge the divides between species, that communities built on compassion rather than judgment are stronger, and that even the most desperate beginnings can lead to lives of meaning and purpose. Grace Sullivan Park's life stood as proof that how we start isn't nearly as important as how we choose to continue, and that sometimes, salvation comes from the most unexpected sources, like a starving dog in an abandoned shed who chose to save a life instead of preserve only her own. That choice, made by an animal who couldn't possibly have understood its full implications, rippled forward through decades, affecting not just one baby's survival but an entire community's understanding of mercy, and ultimately inspiring thousands through Grace's work to extend compassion to the vulnerable, whether human or animal.